History is filled with stories of conquest and resistance, but few are as dramatic, tragic, and unforgettable as the tale of Boudica, the warrior queen who defied the might of Rome. Imagine a land torn between its traditions and the overwhelming force of the greatest empire of the ancient world. Picture villages under the shadow of Roman forts, tribes debating whether to submit or resist, and a people caught between survival and freedom. Now, into this storm steps a queen whose life has been shattered by betrayal, whose dignity has been stripped by cruelty, and whose heart burns with the determination to fight back. This is not just a tale of armies clashing or cities burning. It is the story of how one woman turned personal pain into a force that nearly drove the Romans from Britain. The Romans believed themselves invincible. Their legions had conquered vast territories, their engineers built roads and cities that reshaped landscapes, and their rule stretched across continents. Yet in the far reaches of their empire, in the misty isles of Britain, they faced a rebellion unlike any they had encountered. What made this uprising so extraordinary was not only the scale of destruction it unleashed, but the figure who led it. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, was not expected to command warriors or stand at the head of armies. She was expected to submit, to accept her people's loss of freedom, and to live under Rome's shadow. Instead, she became the embodiment of resistance, the voice of a people who refused to be broken. Her story unfolds like an epic. It begins with uneasy peace under her husband Prasutagus, a king who tried to protect his people through compromise. It then plunges into betrayal when Rome violated that peace after his death, seizing lands, humiliating his widow, and abusing their daughters. From that moment, the fragile balance shattered. What followed was not only rebellion, but an inferno. The Iceni and their allies swept across Britain, destroying Roman cities, overwhelming legions, and leaving behind smoldering ruins where once proud colonies had stood. For a brief and terrifying time, it seemed Rome might lose its hold on Britain entirely. Yet this story is not only about war. It is about courage in the face of impossible odds, the strength of leadership born out of grief, and the enduring power of memory. Though her rebellion ended in tragedy, Boudica became more than a queen. She became a legend, a symbol of defiance that would echo through centuries. From Roman chronicles to modern culture, her name has survived as a reminder that even against the greatest empire the world had ever seen, the spirit of freedom cannot be extinguished. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we will explore the incredible journey of Boudica. We will uncover the roots of her rebellion, follow the destruction she unleashed on Roman Britain, witness her final battle, and trace the legacy that has made her one of history's most powerful symbols of resistance. Stay with us as we bring the untamed spirit of Boudica's story to life. The story of the Roman invasion of Britain and the eventual uprising of the Iceni tribe, led by Boudica, is one of the most dramatic episodes in ancient history. It is not only a tale of conquest and resistance, but also of cultural collision, ambition, betrayal, and defiance against overwhelming odds. To understand how this conflict arose and why it became so significant, we need to look at the circumstances that shaped Roman Britannia, the nature of the Iceni tribe, and the fragile peace that existed before everything collapsed. By setting the stage for what happened after the death of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, we can see how a moment of political maneuvering and Roman overreach led to a rebellion that shook the empire to its core. When the Romans crossed the sea into Britain under Emperor Claudius in the 1st century, their aim was not simply to secure military glory, but to bring the island into the Roman world as a province of the empire. Britain was seen as a land of resources, strategic value, and a place that could add to Rome's prestige. While Julius Caesar had attempted an expedition in the 1st century before the Common Era, his ventures were little more than probes. They revealed both the challenges and the potential of the island, but did not create lasting control. Claudius, however, sought to make the conquest permanent. Roman legions established forts, roads, and settlements. Their rule spread outward from the southeast, gradually imposing order over diverse tribes. The tribes of Britain were far from unified. They had their own leaders, loyalties, and rivalries. Some saw Roman alliance as a way to gain advantage over neighboring tribes. Others viewed the invaders as a dangerous threat to their autonomy. This mixture of submission, resistance, and compromise defined the early decades of Roman presence. In this setting, the Iceni tribe, located in what is now Norfolk, carved out a distinct path. They were not among the most powerful tribes in Britain, but they maintained an unusual degree of independence by striking a careful balance with Rome. The Iceni were proud of their traditions and did not readily give up their way of life. Yet under Prasutagus, their king, they found a way to coexist with the new order. Rome often allowed client kings to rule their territories as long as they recognized Roman authority, paid tribute, and did not openly defy imperial power. Prasutagus followed this approach. His people were not fully absorbed into the Roman system, and they kept much of their internal freedom. For a time, this arrangement worked. Rome avoided the cost of constant war, and the Iceni avoided the loss of everything they valued. Still, this peace was not entirely secure. Rome was never satisfied with halfway measures. Its administrators and military leaders looked for opportunities to extend direct rule. They believed Roman order was superior to the self-rule of tribes, and that true control came only when local rulers were replaced by governors answerable to Rome. The Iceni were tolerated, but they were watched. Their independence, while recognized in practice, was precarious. By the year 60, Prasutagus had grown older. His wealth and his status were recognized both by his tribe and by Rome, but he understood the risk his people faced if he left no clear path for succession. The Romans had a long-standing practice of absorbing kingdoms when client rulers died without a male heir. Prasutagus attempted to prevent this outcome by naming both the emperor and his own family as joint heirs to his estate. It was a calculated move, an effort to secure peace after his death by showing loyalty to Rome while also protecting his household. He may have hoped that the Romans would honor this arrangement, leaving his widow Boudica and their daughters in possession of part of the kingdom. What followed revealed the fragile foundation of the peace between Rome and the Iceni. Instead of respecting the arrangement, Roman officials treated Prasutagus's death as the perfect chance to tighten their grip. They seized his lands, plundered the wealth of the nobility, and treated his family with cruelty. Boudica, now queen, was publicly humiliated, and her daughters were abused. To the Iceni, this was not just political betrayal but a violation of honor, family, and dignity. What had been a careful balance of power collapsed overnight. The situation must be understood against the larger backdrop of Roman Britain at that time. Rome had extended its reach across the south and much of the east, but large parts of the island were still restless. Rebellions had flared in the past, and tensions always ran just beneath the surface. The Romans demanded taxes, requisitioned supplies, and imposed their ways on people who valued their traditions. For many tribes, Roman rule was harsh, but for the Iceni, the sudden stripping away of their independence after years of relative freedom made the insult even deeper. The year 60 was a turning point. Prasutagus's death removed the shield that had protected the Iceni from direct Roman authority. His efforts to secure a compromise by naming Rome as co-heir did not buy safety. Instead, it exposed his people to exploitation. In this moment, Boudica found herself vulnerable. She was a woman in a world where both Romans and many tribes preferred male rulers. She had been personally mistreated and stripped of status. The Iceni had lost their wealth and security. On the surface, it looked like the tribe would be absorbed without resistance, just another casualty of Roman expansion. Yet the very acts that made Boudica vulnerable also created the conditions for her rise. The outrage felt by her people and by neighboring tribes set the stage for a rebellion that would soon sweep across Britain. The Iceni, once a tribe that had accepted limited Roman involvement, became the center of a movement to drive the occupiers out. The peace that had lasted under Prasutagus was gone, replaced by anger and determination. This moment in history captures the essence of the clash between Rome and the untamed spirit of the tribes. It shows how delicate arrangements could crumble under the weight of ambition and arrogance. The invasion of Britain was not only about armies and battles, but also about the choices of leaders, the balance of power, and the refusal of proud people to be silenced. Before the fires of rebellion were lit, there was this fragile peace, the death of a king, and the humiliation of a queen. That was the spark that would ignite one of the most famous uprisings against Roman rule. The death of Prasutagus marked not only the end of a delicate arrangement between Rome and the Iceni, but also the start of an upheaval that would forever be remembered in the story of Britain. His decision to divide his estate between the Roman emperor and his own family was a desperate attempt to secure harmony, but it was interpreted by the Roman authorities as weakness and opportunity. Rather than respecting his will, they stripped the Iceni of their autonomy. His lands were confiscated as if the tribe had been conquered, The noble houses were robbed of their treasures, and the wealth of the Iceni elite was carried off to satisfy Roman greed. What should have been a peaceful transfer of power was transformed into a calculated act of dominance, meant to erase the last trace of independence the Iceni had enjoyed. The Roman response to the death of Prasutagus went beyond political maneuvering. It descended into acts of cruelty designed to break resistance before it even formed. Boudica, widow of the king and mother to his daughters, was singled out for humiliation. She was beaten before her people, a deliberate act meant to display Roman supremacy and to crush her authority as a leader. Worse still, her daughters were subjected to abuse so brutal that it shocked not only the Iceni, but also neighboring tribes who learned of the outrage. The Romans underestimated the effect of these actions. They believed fear would force compliance, but instead it created outrage so deep that it cut through generations of tribal divisions and awakened a fury that had long been smoldering beneath the surface. For the Iceni, this was not simply the violation of a royal family, but a direct insult to their honor, traditions, and very identity. In their world, family and kinship carried weight that went beyond personal bonds. They were tied to the survival and dignity of the tribe itself. To assault the daughters of a king and humiliate a queen was to insult the entire people, to declare them powerless in their own land. Rome had broken the unwritten rules that allowed its authority to coexist with local pride. Now the Iceni no longer had a reason to submit. They had been shown that compromise would not protect them, only resistance might. Boudica, though initially placed in a position of vulnerability, rose from her suffering with a new determination. Her humiliation became her weapon. She was no longer simply the widow of a client king. She became the symbol of everything Rome had done wrong. Her people, enraged by what they had witnessed, rallied around her. Stories of her mistreatment spread quickly, carried by word of mouth across the tribes of Britain. In every retelling, the brutality of the Romans seemed sharper, the injustice deeper, and the call to arms louder. What had been a personal tragedy transformed into a public cause, uniting groups that had once been divided by their own rivalries. The Iceni could not stand alone against the might of Rome, but the injustice they endured created the opportunity to build alliances. The Trinovants, another tribe deeply resentful of Roman rule, became their closest partners. Like the Iceni, they had suffered under Roman exploitation. The loss of land, the demand for tribute, and the arrogance of Roman officials had turned their submission into bitterness. With the leadership of Boudica, their discontent found a clear focus. More tribes joined, drawn by both anger and the possibility of reclaiming freedom. What began as a spark in the east of Britain quickly grew into a fire that could not be ignored. The mobilization of allies was swift, and it revealed how fragile Roman control really was. The empire had forts, roads, and legions, but it did not have the hearts of the people it ruled. For every tribe that had accepted Roman presence for the sake of survival, there were many who resented their heavy hand. The rebellion gave them a chance to strike back. Boudica's call to arms did not need elaborate persuasion. The events that followed Prasutagus' death spoke louder than any speech. All across the land, warriors gathered, their numbers swelling beyond what the Romans could have anticipated. The early actions of the rebellion were both shocking and devastating. The rebels targeted symbols of Roman power, striking at settlements that had come to represent the occupation. The city of Camulodunum, a colonia established for retired Roman soldiers, became one of the first targets. To the tribes, it was more than a city. It was a statement of conquest, a place where their lands had been taken and given to outsiders. Its temple to the deified Claudius stood as a towering reminder of Roman dominance. The rebels descended upon the city with fury, overwhelming its defenses and slaughtering those who resisted. The destruction was total, a clear message that Rome's grip on Britain was not unshakable. News of the fall of Camulodunum spread rapidly, carried not only by survivors, but also by the flames that marked the skyline. Roman settlements, thought to be secure, suddenly looked vulnerable. Panic rippled through the province. Roman officials who had dismissed Boudica as a minor figure now realized the scale of the uprising. The legion sent to relieve the city arrived too late and was ambushed, its soldiers cut down by warriors who knew the land better and fought with a ferocity born of vengeance. This victory emboldened the rebels. Boudica's leadership was both practical and symbolic. She provided a unifying figure around whom disparate tribes could rally, but she also directed their fury toward the most visible targets of Roman occupation. After Camulodunum, the rebels turned toward Londinium, a growing hub of trade and administration. Though not yet the capital it would later become, it was already vital to Roman presence in Britain. The Roman governor at the time, Suetonius Paulinus, understood its importance but recognized he did not have enough troops to defend it. He chose to abandon the city, leaving its inhabitants to their fate. The rebels swept into Londinium, destroying it as they had Camulodunum. Those who had not fled were killed, and the city was burned. The scale of destruction was unmatched. Roman chronicles later described the bodies littering the streets, the smoke rising high above the ruins, and the cries of those who had been trapped inside. For the tribes, this was liberation. For Rome, it was catastrophe. The message was clear: no settlement, no matter how vital, was beyond the reach of the rebellion. The next target was Verulamium, another settlement that symbolized Roman intrusion. Once again, the rebels destroyed it. Everywhere they went, they left ruins in their wake. The rebellion had grown too large to be dismissed as a local disturbance. It was now a full-scale war for the future of Britain. Rome, humiliated and reeling, faced the possibility of losing an entire province to the fury of its people. In these early successes, the Iceni and their allies achieved more than they could have imagined. They proved that Rome could be defeated, that its armies were not invincible, and that its cities were not untouchable. Boudica, who had been humiliated and stripped of power, now stood at the head of a movement that had shaken the greatest empire of the ancient world. The rebellion had been ignited by betrayal and cruelty, but it was sustained by the desire for freedom, vengeance, and dignity. The rebellion that erupted under Boudica's leadership did not remain a localized uprising, but grew into a storm that tore through the heart of Roman Britain with terrifying force. What began as a response to betrayal and humiliation swiftly became an organized campaign of destruction, with the Iceni and their allies aiming not just to punish Rome, but to expel it entirely from their island. The fury that had been kindled in the wake of Prasutagus' death now roared through the countryside, and with every victory, the momentum of the tribes increased. They struck with precision, targeting the very places that embodied Roman authority and control. The Romans had built their settlements as symbols of permanence, yet in a matter of days they were reduced to smoldering ruins, exposing the vulnerability of even the most seemingly secure outposts. Camulodunum, the first capital of Roman Britain, was chosen as the opening strike. To the Britons, it was more than a town. It was a visible reminder of their lands being taken, of Roman veterans planted there as colonists who lived at their expense, and of the arrogance of a foreign empire that thought itself unassailable. The centerpiece of the city, the great temple dedicated to the deified Claudius, stood as an insult to the tribes. It was a monument to the very emperor who had launched the conquest of their island, and it proclaimed that Rome intended to remain forever. The temple's looming presence embodied not only Roman religion, but also Roman dominance, and the Britons saw in it a clear target. The attack on Camulodunum was swift and overwhelming. The inhabitants, mostly veterans and their families, had grown complacent. They believed that Rome's presence on the island ensured their safety, and that the Iceni and Trinovants lacked the power to challenge them. When the rebels came, the city's defenses proved pitiful. There were no strong walls, only a few scattered fortifications. The defenders were unprepared for the fury of thousands of warriors descending upon them. The temple, which had once stood as a proud symbol of Roman power, became a death trap for those who sought refuge inside. The rebels surrounded it, and when they breached its defenses, the slaughter was merciless. Camulodunum, once the proud heart of Roman Britain, was obliterated. Its destruction sent shockwaves throughout the province, and its ruins stood as a warning to every Roman settlement that followed. The Romans attempted to respond, but their efforts only deepened their humiliation. A detachment of legionaries was dispatched to relieve the city, but the column was ambushed before it could reach Camulodunum. The warriors of the Iceni and their allies knew their land well and fought with a ferocity that stunned the disciplined soldiers. The Roman formation collapsed under the sheer weight of numbers and the relentless assault. Few survived, and those who did carried tales of horror back to the rest of the province. Instead of halting the rebellion, this defeat emboldened the tribes, proving that Roman legions could be beaten. After Camulodunum, the next target was Londinium. At the time, Londinium was not yet the grand city it would later become, but it was already an important hub of trade, wealth, and administration. Its position on the Thames made it vital for movement and supply, and it was quickly becoming the economic center of the province. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, recognized its importance, but he also saw the scale of the threat closing in. He had only a small force at his disposal, nowhere near enough to defend the city against the massive host that followed Boudica. Cold calculation guided his decision. He abandoned Londinium to its fate, withdrawing his soldiers to preserve them for a decisive battle later. For the citizens of Londinium, this decision was catastrophic. Without the protection of the legions, they were left defenseless. Many tried to flee when they heard of the governor's withdrawal, but not all could escape in time. When the rebels descended upon the city, they brought with them the same fury that had consumed Camulodunum. The streets that had thrived with trade and activity became rivers of blood. Those who remained were slaughtered, regardless of age or status. The buildings were set ablaze, and the flames consumed warehouses, markets, and homes alike. Londinium burned so fiercely that the smoke could be seen for miles. It was a devastation not just of life, but of economy and infrastructure. Rome had intended Londinium to be the jewel of its province, yet within days it had been reduced to ash. The destruction of Londinium might have been the most shocking single blow, but it was not the end of the rebels' march. From there, they turned their attention to Verulamium. Like the other cities, it was a Roman settlement that stood as a symbol of the new order imposed upon the island. Though it was not as large as Londinium, it was prosperous and important to the Roman network of control. Once again, Suetonius Paulinus was forced to abandon it. He could not risk his small forces being destroyed in a futile defense, so the city was left to stand alone. The rebels swept into Verulamium with the same brutal efficiency they had shown elsewhere. The inhabitants were massacred, and the settlement was burned to the ground. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Boudica's forces went, they left ruin. The rebels were not only exacting vengeance, but also employing a kind of strategy. By striking at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, they attacked the political, economic, and administrative heart of Roman Britain. Each city destroyed was a crippling blow to Roman authority. Each ruin was a symbol to the tribes that Rome could be defeated. The rebellion was not random violence. It was a calculated campaign that combined ferocity with a clear understanding of what targets mattered most. The Romans were caught unprepared for the scale and intensity of the assault. They had underestimated the ability of the tribes to unite, to organize, and to strike at the most vital points. Roman discipline and training were formidable, but in those first weeks of the rebellion, they counted for little against the sheer numbers and fury of the Britons. The legions were scattered, tied up in campaigns elsewhere, or unable to assemble quickly enough to respond. The officials who had treated Boudica's family with contempt had believed Rome's might was untouchable, but now their arrogance was exposed as folly. The tactical brilliance of the rebellion lay in its speed and focus. Boudica and her allies moved too quickly for Rome to gather a proper defense. By the time the governor realized the scale of the threat, 3 of the most important settlements in the province had already been destroyed. The rebels struck where Roman defenses were weakest, and they showed no mercy to those who resisted. This combination of speed, ferocity, and careful choice of targets turned what might have been a localized revolt into a province-wide crisis that threatened to unravel the entire conquest of Britain. The sheer ferocity of the warriors also played a decisive role. They fought with a determination born of outrage, and a sense that they were fighting not just for land or wealth, but for survival itself. The humiliation of Boudica, the abuse of her daughters, the plundering of their estates, and the arrogance of Roman officials had given the rebels a cause that went beyond politics. They fought with the conviction that they were avenging sacred wrongs. Against such fury, the scattered Roman detachments could not hold. The losses suffered by Rome were staggering. Tens of thousands of lives were claimed in the destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium. The ruins stretched across the province like scars, each one a reminder of the empire's vulnerability. For the tribes, these victories were not only practical but also psychological. They shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. For generations, Rome had presented itself as the unstoppable force that brought order and civilization to those it conquered. Now, on the island of Britain, its proud settlements lay in ashes, and its legions were in retreat. At this point in the rebellion, the momentum lay entirely with the Britons. Boudica had turned her personal tragedy into a cause that united tribes and toppled cities. The campaign of destruction was more than vengeance. It was the manifestation of a collective desire to reclaim autonomy. The Romans, who had come to Britain to expand their empire, now found themselves fighting to keep their foothold on the island. The outcome of the conflict was far from certain, but the scale of the devastation already ensured that the story of Boudica and her rebellion would echo for centuries. The ruins of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium still smoldered when the Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, began to prepare his counter-strategy. The scale of destruction had left Roman Britain on the edge of collapse. Tens of thousands had perished, 3 of the most vital settlements were ash, and the legions were scattered. The tribes, carried forward by their victories, believed that nothing could stand in their way. Yet even as panic spread across the province, Paulinus refused to surrender the land to chaos. His training, discipline, and unshakable resolve gave Rome its chance to recover. Paulinus had been campaigning in the west of the island when the rebellion began. He had been focused on subduing the Druids in Mona, the island of Anglesey, a stronghold of resistance that Rome considered dangerous because of its spiritual influence over the tribes. When news reached him of the devastation in the east, he faced a choice. He could continue his campaign in the west or march quickly to confront the rebellion threatening to tear the province from Roman hands. He chose the latter, knowing that if Boudica's forces continued unchecked, Roman authority might be lost forever. Abandoning the campaign in Mona, he gathered what troops he could and began the long march back toward the center of the crisis. The task before him was immense. Boudica commanded a host numbering in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from many tribes united in rage. The Romans, in contrast, could muster only a fraction of that number. The governor gathered the 14th Legion, elements of the 20th, and auxiliaries, but even with reinforcements he had no more than 10,000 men. To face an enemy that may have been 20 times larger seemed reckless. Yet Paulinus trusted the strength of Roman training, the discipline of the legions, and his own ability to choose the battlefield carefully. He knew that only by forcing a decisive confrontation could he hope to end the rebellion. As the rebels advanced, destroying everything in their path, Paulinus selected ground that would favor his smaller, disciplined army. He positioned his forces in a narrow defile with dense forest behind them. The front was constricted, so that the enemy could not use their superior numbers to envelop his flanks. The tribes would be forced to attack head-on, where Roman discipline and tactics could hold firm. His soldiers were arranged in tight formations, shields overlapping, pila ready to be hurled, swords prepared for close combat. Behind them, the forest ensured that no retreat was possible, a grim reminder that the only path to survival lay through victory. Boudica's forces, by contrast, stretched far across the plain before them. Warriors from the Iceni, Trinovants, and many other tribes filled the field, their numbers so vast that Roman chroniclers later described the land as black with bodies. Families had followed the army, bringing wagons that lined the edges of the field. These were filled with dependents, supplies, and the treasures of plundered cities. The rebels had come not only to fight, but to witness what they believed would be the final destruction of Rome's presence in Britain. Before the battle began, Boudica is said to have addressed her people with fierce words, reminding them of the abuses they had suffered, of her own humiliation, and of the freedom that victory promised. Her presence at the head of the host, tall, commanding, and unbowed by suffering, inspired her warriors. They believed they were fighting not only for themselves, but for their ancestors, their children, and the spirits of their land. Against such conviction, Roman officials had once thought resistance impossible. Yet Paulinus and his soldiers stood waiting, grimly determined to show that discipline could withstand fury. The battle opened with the tribes charging across the plain. Their war cries filled the air, and the thunder of their advance shook the ground. They hurled missiles, spears, and stones at the Roman line. But when they reached the legions, they found no collapse, no wavering. At the command, the Romans unleashed their pila. The heavy javelins, designed to pierce shields and bend on impact, tore through the charging mass. Warriors fell in great numbers, their advance slowed by the sudden rain of death. Then the legions closed ranks, shields locked, and the clash of steel began. The disparity in numbers was staggering, yet it was discipline that proved decisive. The Britons fought with passion and bravery, but their sheer multitude became a hindrance. Crushed together on the narrow front, they could not maneuver effectively. Roman soldiers, trained to fight in tight formation, advanced in methodical steps, stabbing with short swords, pressing the enemy back. The cavalry, stationed on the wings, charged into the flanks whenever the opportunity arose, cutting down warriors who tried to break through. The narrow terrain that Paulinus had chosen became a trap. The wagons that the tribes had brought with them, meant to watch the triumph, now blocked their retreat. As the Romans advanced, the warriors found themselves caught between the unyielding line of shields and the barriers behind them. Panic spread. The mass of fighters became a crush of bodies, where those at the rear could not see what was happening at the front, and those at the front could not escape. Roman discipline turned the battlefield into a slaughter. Ancient sources claimed that as many as 80,000 Britons perished that day, though such numbers may have been exaggerated to emphasize the scale of victory. By contrast, Roman losses were said to be fewer than 400. Whatever the exact toll, the outcome was clear. The greatest uprising against Roman rule in Britain had been shattered in a single, decisive confrontation. The tribes that had believed they would sweep Rome from the island were broken, their warriors dead, their families scattered. For Boudica, the defeat was catastrophic. The rebellion she had led with such fire and conviction had been crushed. Yet her end remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claim that, unwilling to fall into Roman hands, she took poison and ended her life on her own terms. Others suggest she fell ill and died soon after the battle. Whatever the truth, she did not live to see the aftermath of the defeat. Her body was never found, her burial place never known. She passed into legend, her fate uncertain, but her name forever remembered. In the aftermath, Paulinus acted with severity. Determined to prevent another rising, he punished the tribes harshly, imposing heavy penalties and stripping away what remained of their autonomy. Yet the rebellion had shaken Rome deeply. Even in victory, the cost of neglect and arrogance had been made clear. For a time, there was discussion in Rome about whether the province should be abandoned altogether. The devastation had been so severe, the risk of renewed uprisings so real, that some questioned whether Britain was worth the effort. Yet the empire held on, rebuilding Londinium, fortifying settlements, and ensuring that no such rebellion would threaten their rule again. Though Rome reasserted control, the memory of Boudica's uprising could not be erased. Her rebellion had shown that even the mightiest empire could be humbled by the fury of a people unwilling to accept subjugation. The destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, the crushing of Roman detachments, and the near collapse of the province all stood as reminders that conquest was never absolute. Rome may have rebuilt, but the scars remained, both in the land and in memory. Boudica's death left behind a legend that grew larger with every retelling. To her people, she became the embodiment of resistance, a queen who stood against the invader when all seemed lost. To the Romans, she was both a warning and a testament to the dangers of underestimating those they ruled. Historians across the centuries have remembered her not simply as a rebel, but as a symbol of defiance, her story told and retold as proof that even in defeat, courage leaves its mark. Her legacy outlasted the empire that once sought to erase her. Long after Roman legions had departed from Britain, her name continued to stir imagination. She represented not just the Iceni, but the unyielding spirit of a people who refused to be broken. Though she lost her final battle, she won something greater, a place in history where her struggle speaks across time. The battle that brought Boudica's rebellion to its tragic close did not erase her presence from history. The fire she had ignited could not be extinguished by swords alone. Though the Romans claimed victory on the field, they carried scars from the destruction she had unleashed, and they were forced to reconsider their entire approach to the governance of Britain. The rebellion was not only the greatest challenge they faced on the island, but also a lesson that power built on arrogance and cruelty would eventually provoke disaster. From the ashes of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, Rome reshaped its policies, balancing severity with pragmatism in order to maintain control. At the same time, Boudica herself became more than a defeated queen. Her story grew in power as generations retold it, transforming her from a historical figure into a legend of resistance and female strength whose voice still resonates today. In the immediate aftermath, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus attempted to secure his position through brutal retribution. He believed the only way to prevent another uprising was to impose the harshest penalties possible on the tribes that had joined Boudica. Lands were confiscated, fines were levied, and communities were punished collectively for the rebellion. Yet his methods sparked unease, even within Roman circles. The destruction had been so widespread, and the slaughter of the battle so severe, that further cruelty risked driving the remaining tribes back into revolt. The Emperor Nero, receiving reports from Britain, grew concerned that the province might become ungovernable if Paulinus continued unchecked. Roman advisors debated whether Britain should even be abandoned, since the cost of maintaining it seemed to outweigh its benefits. In the end, Rome did not withdraw, but it changed its approach. Paulinus was soon replaced as governor by Publius Petronius Turpilianus, a man known for being less severe and more conciliatory. Under his guidance, policies softened. Rather than relying solely on fear, the Romans began to emphasize cooperation, offering certain tribes greater security in exchange for loyalty. Infrastructure projects resumed, roads were repaired, and settlements were rebuilt. The legions remained vigilant, but governors who followed Paulinus learned to temper harshness with diplomacy. The memory of the rebellion lingered as a warning. The province could not be held by force alone. Rome realized that for its empire to endure in Britain, it had to combine military power with political care. Over the longer term, Boudica's uprising influenced the way Roman officials managed frontier provinces in general. Her rebellion highlighted the dangers of mistreating client rulers and their families, as well as the folly of ignoring cultural sensitivities. In provinces far from the center of power, Rome relied heavily on the appearance of stability. The events in Britain showed how quickly that appearance could unravel when local pride was trampled. Though the empire would face many rebellions in other lands, few would rival the devastation wrought by Boudica, and her legacy became a silent lesson shaping Roman governance for decades. While the Romans learned lessons in statecraft, the tribes of Britain carried forward memories of their queen that did not fade with time. To them, Boudica was not merely a woman who had led an uprising. She was a symbol of the spirit of resistance. Oral traditions passed her story through generations, each retelling sharpening the image of a leader who had defied the most powerful empire on earth. Even though her revolt ended in defeat, the very scale of the destruction she had caused to Roman settlements gave her a mythical aura. She had shown that Rome could bleed, and that was enough for her name to endure. Centuries later, when the Romans had long since left Britain, chroniclers began to preserve her story in writing. The Roman historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio provided the earliest accounts, shaped by their own perspectives, but nonetheless ensuring that her deeds were not forgotten. To Tacitus, Boudica was both a warning and a lesson in leadership. His account emphasized the cruelty of Roman officials that had provoked the rebellion, portraying her not as a mere barbarian, but as a queen driven by justice and vengeance. Cassius Dio, writing later, described her in more dramatic terms, even imagining her physical appearance as tall, commanding, and fiery. These accounts, though colored by Roman bias, kept her memory alive through the centuries. During the medieval period, when England was forging its own identity after waves of conquest and change, Boudica's story lay dormant but not erased. It was during the Renaissance and the Age of Elizabeth that her legend was revived with vigor. Scholars rediscovering classical texts found in her tale a figure who resonated with their own struggles. England, often threatened by foreign powers, saw in Boudica a national heroine who had fought against invaders. Under a queen like Elizabeth, Boudica's image as a warrior woman became especially potent. She was celebrated in literature and art as a figure of patriotic resistance, an ancestor of the spirit that defended the nation against Spain and other threats. In later centuries, as Britain expanded into its own empire, Boudica's image continued to evolve. The Victorians, in particular, embraced her as a symbol of national pride. Statues were erected, the most famous being the bronze figure near the Thames that shows her standing tall in her chariot, daughters beside her, hair flowing, a spear raised in defiance. To the Victorians, she represented both the untamed spirit of the ancient Britons and the determination that they believed underpinned their own empire. Her rebellion, though technically a failure, was recast as a triumph of courage and patriotism. Beyond nationalism, Boudica's story began to carry meanings that extended to broader struggles. For women, she became a powerful emblem of female strength and leadership. At a time when history often silenced women, her defiance stood out as undeniable proof that women could lead armies, challenge empires, and command loyalty. Feminist thinkers in later centuries drew on her example to argue that the ability to lead was not bound by gender. She was remembered not only as a queen, but as a mother who had transformed personal tragedy into collective action, turning her daughter's suffering into the fire of resistance. Her story has also continued to appear in literature, where poets and playwrights retold her tale in ways that reflected the concerns of their own times. In the 17th century, when questions of tyranny and resistance to authority filled the air in England, Boudica's rebellion was invoked as a parallel to political struggles. In later eras, when Britain looked back at its own imperial past, writers used her story to reflect on the nature of conquest, subjugation, and freedom. She became not just a figure from history, but a canvas upon which different generations projected their hopes and fears. In modern culture, her presence remains strong. She appears in novels, films, television series, and even graphic novels, each representation adapting her to the needs of the moment. In some portrayals, she is a tragic heroine whose defeat underscores the power of empire. In others, she is a victorious warrior, imagined as having driven the Romans from the island. In all, she is a figure of defiance, her name synonymous with the refusal to submit. Her story resonates in an age that continues to grapple with questions of identity, resistance, and the struggle of the marginalized against dominant powers. She has also become a global symbol, recognized beyond Britain. In discussions of colonialism and resistance, Boudica is often cited as an early example of indigenous defiance against a foreign occupier. Her struggle has been compared to those of leaders in other lands who resisted imperial powers, whether successful or not. In this way, her story speaks to a universal theme: the determination of a people to remain free, even when faced with overwhelming odds. Her legacy continues to inspire new generations, not only in academic study, but also in popular imagination. Students learn of her in classrooms as one of the defining figures of ancient Britain. Artists depict her as both warrior and mother. Activists invoke her name as a symbol of courage in the face of oppression. She stands at the intersection of history and myth, a figure who embodies both the tragedy of defeat and the glory of defiance. The enduring fascination with Boudica lies in the paradox of her story. She was defeated, yet she is remembered as if she triumphed. She died in obscurity, yet her name lives on with greater clarity than those of many victors. Her people were subdued, yet her spirit became unbreakable. In this paradox lies her power. She represents the truth that resistance, even when crushed, can echo louder than conquest. The Romans rebuilt their cities, but the memory of their destruction became part of Britain's cultural heritage. Boudica, though silenced by death, continues to speak across centuries. Her story also forces us to reflect on the nature of empire itself. Rome believed it brought civilization, but Boudica's rebellion reminds us of the cost at which that civilization came. For those who lost their lands, their freedom, and their dignity, Rome's order was a form of oppression. Boudica gave voice to that pain, and in doing so, she stands as a counterbalance to the triumphalism often found in accounts of empire. As the world today continues to wrestle with questions of power, resistance, and justice, Boudica's legacy remains strikingly relevant. She reminds us that even in the darkest moments, leadership can arise from unexpected places. She shows that courage is not measured by victory alone, but by the willingness to stand against impossible odds. She proves that memory can outlast defeat, and that those who resist, even when overwhelmed, shape the narratives of the future. From the smoldering ruins of ancient cities to statues standing tall in modern capitals, from Roman histories to contemporary films, the voice of Boudica endures. Her life was brief, her rebellion crushed, but her spirit is untamed. She remains a figure who transcends time, carrying forward the lesson that defiance can echo louder than conquest, and that the fire of resistance, once lit, can burn across centuries.